Why was San Andreas Stories never made? By now we all know how successful GTA Liberty City Stories and Vice City Stories were. Sure, they weren't exactly the biggest moneymakers at the time, in fact they were quite sandwiched between the greatest and best-selling games, those obviously being San Andreas in 2004 and GTA 4 in 2008. But gamers all over the world fell in love with both of these prequel games because they did more than just expanding the lore with returning and new characters, with some of those becoming iconic to the series, but because they also improved the original formula by adding a lot of extra content and brushing up basic mechanics like shooting and general character movement. But despite all of that, Rockstar never released a San Andreas Stories game to give us the same treatment GTA 3 and Vice City had with their respective prequels, and today I'll try my best to figure out why that was the case and give a concrete answer. This video is mostly based on speculation because we never got a direct answer from Rockstar Games themselves, but I think there's 4 main factors that contributed to this situation. But first, let's talk for a bit about the already existing Stories games. Both of these projects were left in the hands of Rockstar Leeds, a single studio that over the course of 2 years created 2 games, which managed to expand the story and answer a lot of lore questions we previously had, but also implement more things in the free roam and make the most of both Liberty City and Vice City. And VCS especially has a long list of things to do in the open world, despite the map size in comparison to something like San Andreas. And like I've mentioned in my previous video, the 100% checklist takes about the same time even though SA features 2 extra cities in comparison to VCS, which is just crazy to me. Liberty City Stories also manages to improve on the blueprints of GTA 3, improving most mechanical aspects of the game and introducing new and exciting activities in the free roam. Although, unlike Vic's ability to thread the beautiful waters of Vice City, Tony Cipriani is just as bad at swimming as Claude is. These games weren't exactly perfect, especially since they both ran extremely bad on the PS2 versions for some reason, with frame rates sometimes dropping below 20, which is literally unplayable. But the PSP versions of both of these games run on a buttersmooth 30 FPS, and with the amount of content they both have, it was really mind-blowing at the time. Rockstar Leeds would go on to make another beloved game, and in my opinion, a really underrated game just 3 years later, when they released Grand Theft Auto Chinatown Wars. A game that would go back to the roots of the franchise and implement elements of the modern era, and obviously a game that would end up being really loved by the fans. But between VCS's release in 2006 and GTA 4's release in 2008, we had a quiet year where a few people at the time probably expected the release of a San Andreas Stories game that would give us one final game taking place in the 3D universe. But that never happened, and VCS remained the final entry in that era, which isn't a bad thing obviously, because I think it does an amazing job of showing us where it all started. And it's not like Rockstar never showed us what happened prior to CJ's arrival back on the West Coast, because a lot of people either forget or never even knew about the 20-minute introduction movie for GTA San Andreas. The reason a lot of people haven't heard about it is because this only plays out on the original PS2 version of the game and not on any other upcoming port or remaster, which is very strange because it's basically cutting out a lot of important lore and interesting little bits of information regarding various characters we meet in the game. From the most important characters like CJ himself, Big Smoke, Ryder, Sweet, and Tempany, to characters we meet in the later parts of the story like Salvatore Leone, Ken Rosenberg, and Johnny Sindacco, we learn more about the events that take place right before the start of the story, like the Green Saber hit on Grove Street, Salvatore's deal with the Sindaccos and the Forellis for the casino Las Venturas, and we even find out that Tommy is the one who sent Rosenberg to rehab after the events of Vice City. The introduction movie does a great job of showing us bits and pieces of the story that are only briefly mentioned in the actual game, but it also doesn't just spill everything to the players, because some details, like who Tempany is speaking to on the phone in this particular scene, are never revealed, and is left to the interpretation of the fans. So it's not like Rockstar didn't care to show us what the characters were up to prior to the events of San Andreas, but it's definitely not on the same level of making an entire prequel game dedicated to just that. Now, let's get into the possible reasons as to why Rockstar never made a GTA San Andreas Stories game, starting with the platforms it would have been supposed to release on, the PS2 and PSP. While the former wouldn't have really caused much headache for the developers, releasing a prequel game the size of San Andreas on a PSP wouldn't really be possible. Even though Rockstar has a history of making the most of the hardware available at the time, the task of putting a map the size of San Andreas on a portable console was too much even for them. Although I'm not really sure the internet is a reliable source on this matter, if we were to assume these numbers on screen are correct, the size of SA's map is literally 4.7 times bigger than Liberty City and 4.2 times bigger than Vice City's map, which is really impressive, and it goes to show you how much harder it would be to even attempt taking the entire state of San Andreas and trying to squeeze it into the PSP's hardware. And remember, the prequels were developed solely by Rockstar leads and not the entirety of Rockstar Studios. Not only do you have an impossible task, but you also have a limited amount of developers to work on said task, which makes things that much more complicated and basically unachievable. The main counterpoint to this argument would be just cut out San Fierro and Las Venturas and just have the game take place in Los Santos and the surrounding area. But that would sort of defeat the purpose of a prequel, because they are meant to showcase the events on all sides and corners of the original setting. So if you take out 2/3 of the map and only limit yourself to one city, you also limit yourself in the ability to expand the lore for the entire base game. I wouldn't have been against the game taking place in Los Santos alone, so that the game could actually be developed and work properly on the PSP, but it would also feel very strange and incomplete. Now on to my second point. This one ties in with what I just talked about previously. Rockstar's most ambitious project of the late 2000s. A beautiful game with an amazing and deep story and a detailed map, despite being roughly half of San Andreas's in terms of square kilometers. And because leads alone wouldn't have been enough for the SAS project, you obviously couldn't involve other studios without further delaying GTA 4, which would have been a massive mistake, because it went on to become a top 3 game of all time according to Metacritic, which is no small feat. And the pressure to release GTA 4 as soon as humanly possible was sitting on Rockstar's shoulders, because with the release of Sony's PlayStation 3 in November of 2006, game studios around the world were shifting into a new era of high-definition games. And Rockstar wasn't about to enter that era with a game that still had the cartoonish graphics of the 3D era games. Although VCS looked a lot better than its predecessor, it wasn't enough to really make the jaws of gamers drop on the floor. And so Rockstar's next game had to be a PS3 exclusive, and really push the capabilities of that console to what they thought was possible at the time, which wouldn't exactly be the limit, because 5 years later GTA 5 released on the very same hardware. And it wasn't just an arms race to see who could release the greatest and most detailed games on the new and shiny consoles, but by 2006 to 2007, the era of the PS2 games was really coming to an end. Even though more than 3 years have passed since the PS5 was released, games are still coming out on the PS4 to this day, and there are less PS5 exclusive games that have came out than you can count on one hand. But that's mostly because the PS4 to PS5 shift was more to do with frame rate and loading time improvements than anything else. If you put two games side by side, one made on a PS4 and one on PS5, the differences can be hard to spot, because at least for now, developers are making use of the improved hardware to simply reduce loading times and increase the frame rate from the PS4's famous 30 to a nice and smooth 60. But when you compare the jump from the PS2 to the PS3, the differences are night and day. To make things more mind-blowing, the difference in raw power of the PS3 compared to the PS2 is about 35 times higher. The difference in raw power of the PS5 in comparison to the PS4, however, is only about 8 times higher. Still somewhat impressive, but not as impressive as the jump in power of the PS3 to its predecessor. So unlike nowadays where companies still willingly develop games on the PS4, mainly because a lot of gamers haven't made the switch yet, back then there was a bigger incentive to get working on a PS3 title as soon as possible. And finally, the fourth reason as to why Rockstar didn't attempt to make a San Andreas Stories game was because the base game itself was already kind of 3 games into one. I mean, the story's length alone is that of Vice City and GTA 3 combined. And not to mention some open world elements that we've never seen again in another upcoming game. Like being able to go to the gym not only to change your character's appearance, but also to learn 3 different fighting styles. I know I'm doing a bit of cherry picking here, but I'm surprised Rockstar didn't feature that in GTA 5. And I say GTA 5 because we all know GTA 4's main selling point and focus was the story and realism, and not the RPG elements we all know and love from San Andreas. The fact that the story takes us on a long journey from the gang warfares of East Los Santos into the countryside, to the beautiful San Fierro and the unique architecture it features, to then the deep parts of the desert, then the glamorous and full of nightlife parts of Las Venturas, and finally back into the streets of Los Santos to seek revenge is just amazing. It's basically a roller coaster ride, and one that is executed really well. So the sheer amount of content San Andreas offers and the addition of a 20-minute introduction movie is sufficient enough in my eyes to justify the lack of a dedicated prequel game. And yes, it would have been nice to play through the lens of a returning character like Sweet, Ryder, or maybe even Caesar, or perhaps an entirely new character that we've never seen before, but it doesn't feel like we really needed to have that. But if you disagree and feel like you need that story's game experience for San Andreas as well, allow me to talk about the gameplay that's been on screen for the entirety of the video. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas Stories is a community project that seeks to tell the tale of young Brian Johnson in 1987. Perhaps a bit too young actually. While this mod is far from perfect, with questionable dialogue and a very simple mission design, I can appreciate the passion for the project, and one day I hope to see a complete version of it. But if that also doesn't satisfy you enough, well, I don't know what to tell you. Perhaps you could write your own fanfic. It's clear that Rockstar never intended to release or even develop a prequel to GTA San Andreas, but it's not like we missed crucial and important lore that will forever be unknown to the public. The game wouldn't have been worth making despite the popular opinion that it was a missed opportunity. But no matter what your stance on the subject is, we can all agree that GTA San Andreas does a great job at telling a good story, and it started a good trend where the protagonists were much better written and had a lot more depth to them than just simply being money-hungry thugs. Starting with Carl Johnson, then moving on to Nico Bellic, and most recently Arthur Morgan, Rockstar understood that a good story needs a well-written main character, and they almost always improved their writing when it came to that. With GTA 6 on the way, I hope this trend is going to continue, and that hopefully we'll see a new and interesting dynamic between the two main characters. It's not just the marvelous open worlds that Rockstar is really good at making, but also telling a fitting story for each of the settings and the characters involved. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. And while you're there, also leave a like, and of course, consider subscribing if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching.